Okay, the talk is asking a simple, but of course also a very, very complex question. And it asks, what does it mean to be human in the 21st century? And crucially, in what ways does disability enhance these meanings? So my position is that disability, rather than leading us to think about lack in relation to the human, actually allows us to think in productive and possible ways. So in addressing this question, we seek to work through entangled connections between nature, society, technology, medicine, biopower and culture, to consider the extent to which the human might be an outdated phenomenon. And perhaps we might want to think about replacing this notion of the human with what Rosie Braidotti says, or terms as the post-human condition. There's a picture of the wonderful Rosie Braidotti in front of her equally wonderful bookshelf. You'll also see on the photo of those people who, like me, lack a social life, the photos of Deleuze and Guattari. I imagine that's how they used to write their books, just sit there for a while and randomly put together words. And this paper is, I'd hope, haunted by their ideas, as well as the work of Braidotti and others. The main idea that, if you like, pushes this paper is the idea of disability. Disability, then, is considered to be a number of things. It's considered to be a political category. It's considered to be an identity. And crucially, it's considered to be a moment of relational ethics. The disability pushes it in these, dare I say, exciting ways. And I want to argue that disability and disability studies are perfectly at ease with the notion of the post-human, because disability has always contravened the traditional, classical, humanist conception of what it means to be a human being. So in the paper, what I want to do is to work through three themes of a number of themes that Braidotti sketches out in her book, but I want to flesh these out, and I use that term advisedly, if you like, through thinking through disability. And again, going back to the work of writers such as Tchaikovsky, disability is almost like a moment to pause and think about the human, but I also think disability is something that keeps us very mobile in our thinking about what it means to be a human. So, what I want to do is to think about the ways in which disability, and his reference to some of my colleagues across the universities of Sheffield and Manchester Metropolitan University, who have, I believe, urged us and pushed us to think again about what it means to be human. Now, Braidotti's book, the 2013 book, I don't know if anyone has had the pleasure of reading this, it starts off in a way I would suggest very similar to Frantz Fanon's book, where he talks about the sense of, for some of us, never ever being recognised as human. And the quote here says that not all of us can say with any degree of certainty that we've always been human, or that we're only that. Some of us are not even considered fully human, let alone at previous moments of Western social, political and scientific history. So in this sense, what I think Braidotti does, and this is a well-worn argument really, is to suggest that humanity is very much a male of the species. The humanist human, which is captured well here in this image of Vitruvian man, is, to quote her, a he. He tends to be white, European, handsome and able-bodied, an ideal of bodily perfection. And she also pushes it further. She says that this humanist human is implicitly assumed to be masculine, white, urbanised, not living in Montreal, speaking a standard language, heterosexually inscribed in a reproductive unit, and a full citizen of a recognised polity. I love that quote because when you present that to people, they just think, Christ, that's so dull. But, that's kind of the humanist human that we're talking about. Moreover, it's a rational animal endowed with language. Now, of course, humanism has a Eurocentric core and it has imperialist tendencies. But we know from disability studies, scholars, they would add to this humanism's convenient relationship with these idealized notions of the human, they would add processes such as medicalisation and psychologisation, which have colonised the mind or the psyche and the body. So the disabled and non-Europeans become known in terms of what they are not. And what they are not often is a human being. Now, so here we have the problems with the humanist human, but let us straight away recognise the perils or the dangers of tinkering or tampering with a humanist ideal. If you say to somebody, I'm not quite happy with this notion of the human, maybe we should get rid of it, then understandably people might throw things at you. For example, all those people within the disabled people's movement who've helped to write up and contribute to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. A little bit of feedback, try and get the title shorter, would have been mine. Is that within that process is this recognition of being a human too. Yeah? And what we know is that, like all good conventions, it says two things. One, disabled people are human. And two, this humanity should be recognised. And that still is a profound thing to do. Yeah? Across the globe, this is a way of recognising oneself when oneself has been ostracised or marginalised. So we recognise, and I think Braidotti recognises, that we can get ourselves into some dangers when we tinker with the human. But the point is that we are entering, particularly now, a time where the human is not as easily recognisable as perhaps it once was. I would actually add to that, perhaps it never is as recognisable as sometimes the humanist human might present. So here we have a beautiful picture, or a scary picture, depending upon your view, of a university professor, only joking, a child with an iPad. And we know this. My biggest single argument in life, apart from with people on Twitter, which is suggesting again I need to develop a social life, is with my 12-year-old and my 30-year-old daughters, who spend too much time on their iPhones, in my humble opinion. I don't say that to them. I don't say in my humble opinion. I say things like, get off the phone! But clearly things are happening. We know now that things are becoming a lot more difficult and tricky than they once were. For Braidotti, this image, I think she would say, is a nice kind of a way of capturing a signifier, if you like, of the ways in which the typical unitary, embodied, closed-in, solitary human being is opening themselves up into the world through technology. She says this: the 21st century citizen is a knowing subject with the potential to free us from the provincialism of the mind, the sectarianism of ideologies, and the dishonesty of grandiose posturing and the grip of fear. Or, as I like to call it, we Google. So the Googling, in some sense, instantly opens up, makes us potentially, to use a term, a knowing subject. Now, at the same time, we need to acknowledge that technology is also being used to occupy a humanist position. It allows people to say, yes, I am someone that should be recognised at the humanist table. But there's something more going on here that I want to turn to, and this is where we will find it through disability, is the sense that in the current, if you like, year or 2014, the human is such an expanded entity that one wonders if old ideas of the human can actually capture it. So what Braidotti urges us to do is this, and I'll quote, page 153, not that I'm in any way anal about these things. She says, we need to find the courage to move beyond an exclusive concern for the human to embrace more planetary intellectual challenges. This not only means shifting how we understand the human, but also our relationship with our environments, our world, and human and non-human inhabitants of our planet. And in this, recognising this for Braidotti, is this move to what she terms the post-human condition. So, just briefly, the post-human condition for Braidotti is, and interesting, I'm not going to read this quote, but there's something quite circular going on within it, is this notion that the knowing subject is now a complex assemblage of human and non-human, planetary and cosmic, given and manufactured, And this requires major readjustments in how we now think of ourselves and others and the world around us. The crisis of humanism, that is the realization that we all fail to dance to the beat of the drum of the idealized big subject of modernity, means that, quoting again Braidotti, structural others of the modernist humanistic subject re-emerge with vengeance. And she has this lovely quote, which brings together a politicized position with her post-human ideas. She says this: "The great emancipatory movements of postmodernity have their fires stoked by structural others such as the pro-environment, anti-nuclear and anti-globalization." And I would also add here disability movements. Disability movements that too often in many transformative writings are either ignored or kind of, towards the end added on when people are reminded that disabled people actually exist. So what Braidotti is doing here is she's getting us to think about the human, or the, if you like, the extension of the human, and the moral and the political and ethical questions associated with the human in a number of ways. And I want to talk through three themes. So what I want to do is I want to talk through the notion of life beyond the self, this idea of rethinking and enhancement, life beyond the species, rethinking animal, and in doing that actually the human. And thirdly, I want to think through life beyond death, rethinking death. And these are all taken from Braidotti and her conception of what it means to be post-human. And what I want to do is to suggest that these are helpful ideas, but that actually, if Braidotti or others interested in contesting the human, if they're looking for the space, the site, to use Ron McCalker's phrase, the scene of the crime, or the scene of where we look at the ways in which some people are deemed to be more human and others not, then disability is the place. But of course I would say that when my title is Professor of Disability Studies, I suppose. So what I want to do is to very briefly now introduce you to what disability and disability studies can do. One argument here is that disability is, we could argue, the quintessential post-human condition. That disability necessarily demands interdependent connections with other humans, technologies, and non-human entities, communication streams, and people and non-people networks. Quite simply, disability complicates the myopic perspective and non-representative nature offered by humanism. In a project that I was involved in with a colleague, Janice McLaughlin, at the University of Newcastle, which looked at the experiences of disabled babies and their families, we came across a child of 1 year old with the label of Down syndrome, who by that time had had contact with over 120 health, social care and educational professionals. At the age of 120. That's some serious engagement with others. Now, that raises straight away the question, well, why are all those kind of connections going on there? What kind of things are being served by those connections? And one then gets thinking about what kind of entity is left after all of those connections. And indeed, over the years, disability scholars have emphasized the ways in which disability, to use the words of Tanya Tishkovsky, urges us to think productively about the human. So, Tom Shakespeare in 2002 argues that disability emphasizes interdependence instead of endlessly desiring independence. There's a great quote from a disability activist, I think it was Liz Crow, who said, "How many people cut their own hair?" Well, I do, obviously. But how many cut their own hair? We all are in some ways connected with others. Disability pushes this further. Families of disabled children, for example, tell us, and a common language we hear from when we speak to families of disabled children is the notion of struggle and fight, and an endless replaying, if you like, of the relationships between their family and the wider community. Moreover, the political work of disability organisations, such as People First, for example, and people first is a term employed by people with the label of intellectual disabilities to define their politics. I mean, just think about that for a minute. We are people first. You don't get anything more quite profound than that as a form of political, if you like, demands, have always demonstrated the need for distributed support, distributed competence. They might not use words like that, but they would say things like, we need the support of others, and that's okay. So disability then emerges at this post-human time that Braidotti and others are talking about as a moment of relational ethics. That is, it urges us to think again about how we are all made through our connections with others, and more than that, disability encourages to embrace ways of living that are not rigidly framed by humanistic values of independence and autonomy. And that's a quote from Kirsty Lydiard. So disability and projects of disability seem to kind of move very neatly alongside, perhaps into and parallel with post-human projects. So what I want to do is to kind of think through then the ways in which disability is an opportunity. This is another lovely quote from Braidotti. She says this: the human is a normative convention which does not make it inherently negative. It's okay to be normal sometimes. We have to be normal, then you don't get arrested. Just highly regulatory and hence instrumental to practices of exclusion and discrimination. We know that some people are allowed the category of the human and some people are denied it. So of course we want rights. We want human rights to be recognised. But we also know, for example, in Britain, that we can have a variety of what might be seen to be human rights-based legislation and policies, but disabled children still don't get invited to non-disabled children's birthday parties. Now that might sound like a hashtag first world problem. But what it does do is it actually demonstrates that regardless of this, if you like, engagement with the category of the human, shit still happens. And no doubt these fights will go on to secure some recognition within the register of the human. But at the same time, we know globally that alongside these battles to be recognised as human, there are other everyday negotiations, performances, lobbying, debates, embodiments, relationalities, emotionalities, and recognitions that are being demanded by disabled people and their allies in the communities that they live. And these practices, I want to suggest, are as equally important. So let us think then through 3 disabled post-human possibilities, and more importantly, A, see if Braidotti is talking any sense, and B, if she is, what does disability add to the consideration of the post-human? Okay, so what I want to start is to think about life beyond the self, or rethinking enhancement. Now, for Braidotti, in the post-human condition, matter is not dialectically opposed to culture, nor to technological mediation, but continuous with it. So matter and culture are endlessly kind of feeding into one another in the ways described by many materialist feminists for a number of years. Braidotti says, we have entered an epoch of pan-humanity, where each and everything is technologically mediated. The question is not, should we be enhanced by technology? The question should be something along the lines of, what ontological, ethical, and political questions are raised by our technological enhancement? Or is the iPhone fucking us up? Or actually doing something maybe positive with us? An argument, just to clarify, that I would not use with my own children, for that would be inappropriate and rude. So when we think of enhancements, of course, we are plunged into the shiny, sexy world, to be careful how you say that, of sci-fi and cyborgs. Here's an example. If you type in cyborg on Google, be careful, you get drawn into a variety of forum and chat rooms and end up meeting people in Manchester on a Wednesday evening when you shouldn't have done. But that's maybe time for another paper. I'm going to have to do this. To quote the British musician Damon Albarn, who's recently observed we are everyday robots, plugged into the global information superhighway by our smartphones and our relentless use of social media. At the same time, as Gregor Walbring, a Canadian disability scholar, cautions, one needs to ask what kinds of enhancements are being produced and promoted through technology. Indeed, what kinds of lacking humanity does technology have in mind when it wants to enhance us? So for Walbring, this celebration of the life beyond the self promoted by Braidotti needs to be treated with caution. Because if we take, for example, the idea that if we were to develop a wheelchair that could actually go up steps, a point made by Nick Watson in a project he did around the social implications of the wheelchair, would we be happy that that wheelchair is getting us up the steps? Or is this saying something wider about the ways in which our wider physical spaces are normatively conceived in ways whereby unless you walk, you kind of shot it? So there's a need to be cautious here, and disability reminds us of the need to be cautious around enhancement. At the same time, the one argument could be made is that disability has always been about enhancement. That it's always been about this kind of complex relationship between the body and the machine, between matter and between technology. So some examples would be as follows. This is a picture of what has been deemed a futuristic wheelchair. I'm not being funny, but I'm a bit disappointed with this already. You can't fly, for God's sake. That's what I want from it. But one might, if we take this notion of the posthuman, we might want to revisit this wheelchair user as a cyborg. That might be a nice, helpful way of thinking through things. The second image tries to capture the notion of a disabled person employing a number of personal assistants. So rather than a disabled person lacking, they are actually an assemblage of humanity. The image here is of a blind woman walking down the street with the support of a guide dog, or a complex hybrid of human and animal. Again, disability pushes us towards these post-human ideas. The augmentative and alternative communication user, long before the iPad was invented, was already a productive blending of wetware and hardware. The child labelled with special educational needs, I'm not going to tell you which one it is in this image. It's because it's not even actually an image of that, but I just thought I'd throw this in, is either somebody who takes up a lot of resources from the other children or extends educational opportunities for everybody. And we know from research that you have disabled children in classrooms, then actually other non-disabled kids' learning experiences can be improved. The tube-fed baby reminds us that technology gives life and gives life to technology. The person with so-called label of profound intellectual disabilities, whose very existence permits the employment of 4 people to offer 24/7 support, widens our sense of what it means to be interdependent. Parents with intellectual disabilities demand us to think again about parenting competence. Quite simply, if you're a parent with a label of intellectual disabilities and you've still got your children, you've reached a gold standard of parenting no one in this room will ever achieve because of the amounts of surveillance that they have to endure. And I want to move on to now the notion of the life beyond the species, which is a second theme of 4 within the book, but I'm going to take a look at 3. One of the most exciting moments for the post-human condition for Braidotti is that we stop being so anthropocentric, that we stop bigging up and celebrating everything that's to do with the human or the humanist human. And more than that, recognise notions of trans-species solidarity. And this is where Braidotti very much is drawing upon the work of Deleuze and Guattari. She talks about the need for us to all think about how we might become animal, or become animal and human together. And I'm thinking here about the work of Rob McCalco and his beautiful text, which is a 1999 text, which looks at the becoming together of animal and human being. Too often, Braidotti writes, that we think of animals in terms of a taxonomy of 3 groups. Those we eat, those we watch TV with, and those we're scared of. Now, what's interesting we could add to the taxonomy there in terms of disability is that we have animals that are companions, animals that are supporters, animals that are workers, and maybe animals that become overworked. So what disability allows us to think then is about the kinds of relationships we have with animals. And more than that, the kind of alliances we would want to create with animals. And in doing so, this pushes us out, according to Beatty, away from a kind of speciesism and starts us to ask ethical questions about not just animals and humans, but also humans and humans as well. I'll just read a quote from Margaret Shildrick and Janet Price's beautiful piece where they talk through the kind of relationships that disability prompts us to think about. And this is their quote. "The disabled woman who relies on an assistant or carer to help her prepare for a sexual encounter, be it in terms of dressing appropriately, negotiating toilet facilities, or requiring direct physical support in a comfortable sexual position, is not different in kind from other women, but simply engaged more overtly in just those networks that Deleuze and Guattari characterise as desiring production. Similarly, a reliance on prosthetic devices, the linkages between human, animal and machine, would figure not as limitations, but as transformative possibilities of becoming other along multiple lines of flight." That was a bit of Deleuze and Guattari word bingo played there by Shildrick and Price, throwing in as many of the kind of ideas of Deleuze and Guattari as possible. What I like about it, that quote, is it gets us to think again about the kind of connections that human beings might want to be making as they extend themselves out, as they try to live life beyond their species. And back to Ron McCalco's work, this raises some ethical and political and challenging questions. And I think in his ethico-political account of life with a guide dog and companion animal, we're encouraged to reflect, what do we ask of animals? What are our ethical rights to do so? And how do humans and animals become together? And interestingly and importantly, and also one might say shockingly, the animal is often referred to and does appear in representations and discussions of disability. Shame on me, but this is actually taken from the Daily Mail newspaper, or the Daily Nazi, as we like to call it, in the UK. The reason I use it is to look at the way in which this newspaper reported the shocking abuse cases at Winterbourne View, a residential hospital in Bristol. I don't know if this story got to you in Canada, but this was the story of systemic violence by care staff against adults with intellectual disabilities. And what actually happens within the portrayal of what happened to these service users, there's an interesting euphemism, is that we had within the representation a number of kind of, in whistleblowing, a number of kind of blames being made at individual care workers. These were violent, bad, evil people that were doing these kind of things, rather than actually asking maybe institutionally the system is set up in ways that might encourage those kinds of actions. Well, that's for a different discussion. But what is interesting in this representation is underneath that photo caption it reads, "Vile. Care workers dragged vulnerable patients around like animals at the Winterbourne View private care home in Bristol." And there is the image to show that. What is illuminating about that quote is the way in which the animal is evoked as a way of talking about abuse. Winterbourne shocks because humans were being treated like animals. One assumes it would be doubly shocking to treat non-disabled people as if they were animals. It would appear that there is an unconscious human desire to view animals as less than human, and in some cases treat certain categories of human as if they were not. Non-humans would be people with learning disabilities. Now, the trouble with this anthropocentric position is it again upholds, as Beatty calls it, transcendental human exceptionalism. It has the potential to expel those of us that fail to match up to its standards. The care workers failed, they were vile, they themselves were like animals. And in this kind of way of thinking through, there's a danger, because what it does is it leaves the human as a category that's untroubled and seemingly the right category, and views the animal as non-human and often the recipient of kinds of behaviour that we would not do to human beings. Let me remind you of the quote. Care workers dragged vulnerable patients around like animals. One might want to throw in there, care workers dragged vulnerable patients around like the categories of human that are deemed in the current socio-political climate around the ways in which we understand what it means to be human. That wouldn't get printed in the Daily Fascist, though. Well, that's for another consideration. So what we have here then is that disability, because disability is historical relationships often with its extended connections of, firstly, the extension of humanity, but also disability's space or relationship with the notion of the animal, whether it be practical through support or whether the animal is evoked to describe certain disabilities. This might be a way again of us thinking of a life beyond the species. The third and final theme I want to talk about is Braidotti's notion of life beyond death, or rethinking death. Now this, I think, is particularly an important intervention in Braidotti's posthuman approach. In a recent research project that I was involved with Catherine Runswick-Cole, we were fortunate to meet and talk with some young disabled people who were living with life-limiting and life-threatening impairments. So these were young people who, in short, realised they were going to die. Their perspectives on the value of their short lives were, in surprise to us perhaps, incredibly productive. They shared with us their concerns, their worries and their sadness. They told us of how difficult their families found their prognosis. But they crucially also told us of jokes, shared fun stories, sexual ambitions, and exciting projects that they were involved in. They demanded us to rethink about how we put together words such as valued, quality, life and living in their discussions with us. They also asked us to revisit our unproblematic and inherently deficit-leaning thoughts around death. And indeed, one of the disability slogans in North America was not dead yet. Now, what Braidotti suggests is that within a posthuman condition, we are to think again and, crucially, more affirmatively rather than depressingly about notions of life and death. And indeed, these young people did this with us. They asked us and they urged us and they encouraged us to think positively and productively about death, disability and short lives. And this, we think, is something maybe also part of the post-human condition. Indeed, Jasbir Puar proposes that all of us now are living as global citizens with debility. So we're living with the notion of debility. And perhaps nowhere is this more the case than children and young people who are living with life-limiting impairments. So the young people and a post-human condition push us to ask some interesting and tricky questions. How might we think positively about death? How might we think about short lives in ways which are not endlessly about misery? Of course, honouring the idea that families, no one's denying that families would not be sad about their children dying young, but to think again about how we understand quality, life, and crucially death. In what ways then can we promote valued understandings of real bodies facing death? How can death, disability, and short lives be conceptualized in less liminal and pathological ways? Again, disability intervenes. One might argue that children with life-limiting and life-threatening impairments are pioneers. They're pioneers in terms of getting us to think again about what counts as a valued life and what it means to die. Death and short lives then are pulled away from a depressive position to think again in a productive space. More than that, many of the young people we spoke to were also plugged into a variety of human and non-human assemblages, machines that were there to give them life, to deal with pain. Relationships, everyday caring relationships, palliative care, in which their humanity or their shared humanity, their pan-humanity, was being valued. This is not to deny the tragedy of young people dying far too early. Rather, it's about inviting an alternative conceptualisation of life and death, what Braidotti calls a relational vitality. Okay, so where does this lead us then in terms of concluding and thinking about the relationships between the posthuman and disability studies? Braidotti adapts Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the pedagogy of the concept when she argues this on page 104, that thinking is about the invention of new concepts and new productive ethical relations. In this respect, she argues, theory is a form of organised estrangement from dominant values. I love that. A form of organised estrangement from dominant values. And I share this view of theory and of the view that disability is also allows us to become estranged from dominant values. So we also think that disability brings something critical, politicised and rich to posthuman theory. The sense here is that disabled people and disabled people's politics are already fighting with and using and wanting to be recognised by the human register, but equally are already enacting forms of activism, art and relationality that pushes all to think more imaginatively about what it means to be or become. So disability politics then is potentially where it's at if we're thinking about the ways in which we can think through human and posthuman possibilities. So to finish then, disability disavows the human. Disavow in that classic psychoanalytic sense. It desires the human and it rejects it equally at the same time. And in this dynamic, necessarily contradictory play with the human, we find possibility. Disability allows us to think again about ourselves, about our relationships and our politics. And posthuman disability studies capture the now and the future of our activism and our thinking. Thank you.